What would you do if the man who stole everything from you, your company, your fiancé, and your future, ended up sleeping with your own sister? Most people would fall apart. I didn't. I watched. I waited. And then I planned. But here's the twist. The sister he thought he was seducing, she was in on it. With me. Because when Caelum Stroud betrayed me, he didn't just create an enemy, he awakened a strategist. And now every lie, every stolen night, every secret is part of something much, much bigger. This isn't a story of heartbreak. This is a story of precision. I was born into control. By the time I was 29, I had co-founded a fast-rising fintech startup, orchestrated millions in venture capital, and stood on the edge of IPO territory. My name is Alaric Vane, and I don't just build systems, I make sure they don't collapse. I understood people the way engineers understand structures, pressure points, tolerances, thresholds. And just like any system, people crack when pushed the right way. But I didn't grow up to be cold. I grew up to survive. My fiancée, Delphina Hart, was everything I thought I needed. Intelligent, composed, with an MBA from Stanford and a jawline carved out of confidence. She wasn't flashy. She was focused. We met during a pitch night where she eviscerated a founder with numbers so sharp I nearly applauded. We didn't fall in love. We chose it. Delphina didn't believe in romance, only in alignment. And for a while, our visions aligned. Then came Caelum Stroud. He was an early investor in my company, the kind who charmed boardrooms in tailored suits and could turn a weak idea into a strong sell just by stepping into the room. On paper, he was everything a founder should want in a partner. But beneath the surface, I always felt the instability, the hunger that wasn't about growth, but conquest. Caelum moved fast, too fast. He pushed for aggressive mergers, sidestepped due diligence, and loved backdoor deals. I chalked it up to ambition. I was wrong. And then there was Seraphine Vane, my younger sister by 3 years. A gifted violinist turned gallery curator. Seraphine was the fire in our otherwise sterile family. Where I was calculated, she was impulsive. Where I planned, she felt. Our parents were cold financiers who tried to mold us both into tools. I broke away through logic. Seraphine rebelled through art. We weren't close for a long time, but when things started falling apart, she was the only person I didn't need to pretend with. It began subtly, the way betrayals always do. Delphina started staying late at work. At first, I believed her. Then I noticed the silences, not the loud kind, but the smooth ones. Practiced. I once asked about a gala Caelum had mentioned, assuming she hadn't attended. She said she hadn't, but 3 days later I saw her in the background of a socialite's photo posted on Instagram, next to Caelum, hand on his arm, smiling. I told myself it was coincidence. Business. Until coincidence started stacking like corpses. I began to see the pattern, the business trips that lined up, the calendar invites that disappeared, the coded glances across boardrooms. But suspicion isn't proof, and a man in my position can't afford paranoia. So I did what I do best. I built a system. First, I hired a private investigator. Quiet, discreet. I didn't want dirt, I wanted patterns, movement, timing, emotion. What I got was betrayal, photos, conversations, text logs. Delphina and Caelum weren't just sleeping together. They were building something. Meetings with my competitors, discussions about board leverage, even a plan to push me out of my own company after the next funding round. And worst of all, they looked happy. They laughed in those photos. They kissed without looking over their shoulders. It wasn't just cheating. It was strategy. It was theft. It was a corporate coup wrapped in pillow talk. I broke that night. Not loudly, not visibly. But something inside me calcified. It wasn't the loss of Delphina that crushed me. It was the insult of it, the underestimation, the idea that they thought I wouldn't see it coming, or worse, that I wasn't strong enough to fight back. But I didn't scream. I didn't confront. I didn't even cry. I called Seraphine. We hadn't spoken properly in nearly a year. She answered on the second ring. When I told her everything, she didn't say, "I'm sorry." She said, "Finally." Turns out she had her own suspicions about Delphina, about Caelum, about the way I'd been retreating inward and shutting her out. And then she said the thing that changed everything. "If you want revenge, I'm in." That night, something dark and beautiful began. Seraphine moved into my spare apartment the next week, not because she needed to, but because we needed to become allies, partners, co-conspirators. She played the perfect role, not just the loyal sister, but the tempting stranger. Caelum, for all his cunning, was still a man, and Seraphine knew how to command attention, not with overt seduction, but with elegance, with mystery, with wit. And Delphina? She didn't suspect a thing. She believed she was on the path to everything she ever wanted: power, prestige, and the perfect partner in Caelum. She didn't realize she was walking into a story we were already writing, a story where she was not the author. From that point on, we stopped calling it heartbreak. We called it rehearsal, because the performance was coming, and they had no idea they were about to be center stage. Alaric couldn't pinpoint when the doubt began. Perhaps it was the way Caelum laughed a little too loudly at Seraphine's jokes, or how her eyes would dart away, lingering on him just a second too long when they thought he wasn't watching. For a while, he brushed it off. Paranoia, he told himself. She was his sister. Caelum was his friend, his lawyer, his confidant, his mistake. The signs didn't appear all at once. They crept in slowly like water under a closed door, seeping into his life and warping everything he thought was solid. It was a forgotten jacket at Caelum's apartment, the same designer Seraphine swore she had lost. It was the late-night texts Seraphine claimed were from clients, though they stopped abruptly when Alaric entered the room. It was the business dinners Caelum insisted on attending alone. He confronted none of it. Not yet. Alaric had learned that silence was more powerful than outrage. He watched. He listened. He took note. And then came the night he was supposed to leave for Zurich, a last-minute tech conference, one he had purposely fabricated. He kissed Seraphine goodbye, noted the flicker of guilt in her expression, and left. Only to circle back, parking his car a block away, waiting in the dark. 3 hours passed. When the lights in their penthouse dimmed and the soft glow of Caelum's familiar silhouette crossed the glass balcony, Alaric knew. He didn't move, didn't scream, didn't cry. He simply watched. The betrayal was no longer a theory. It had shape, breath, heat, real, undeniable. And the sharpest sting wasn't the infidelity itself, but the orchestrated precision of it, the choreography, the deception they maintained in front of him while scheming behind his back. What tore at his chest was how Seraphine had looked at him just that morning, laughing, touching his arm, pressing her lips to his temple. That kind of performance required effort and cruelty. The next day, Alaric returned to the apartment as if nothing had happened. Seraphine greeted him in his robe. She made coffee. He sipped it with a steady hand, listening to her lie about the quiet night she'd spent binge-watching documentaries. He said nothing. Instead, he pulled out his tablet and scrolled through his schedule, noting Caelum's upcoming cases. A familiar name appeared, his own company's IP dispute, which Caelum had volunteered to handle pro bono. It was all becoming clear now. This wasn't just personal, it was strategic. Alaric was funding Caelum's reputation as a legal prodigy. Worse, he was paying for the lifestyle Seraphine and Caelum were enjoying together, under his roof, within his life, using his love. Later that week, he took Seraphine to dinner at her favorite place, the corner French bistro with soft jazz and dim candlelight. She smiled the whole time, eyes sparkling under the chandelier. "I missed this," she whispered. He smiled back, feeling bile in his throat. "That's good to hear," he said, "because I think we're going to be spending a lot more time together soon." She laughed. Finally done building your empire? Something like that. She didn't notice the chill in his voice. She didn't realize he had already begun shifting money, calling in favors, erasing traces. The war had started and she was already losing. It would have been easier to confront them, easier to explode, to accuse, to scream and demand apologies. But Alaric wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted to dismantle them, slowly, precisely. He planted decoys, subtle mentions of new deals, foreign accounts, restructuring. He watched Caelum bite the bait every time, adjusting his legal advice accordingly, never realizing he was being fed false information. Meanwhile, Seraphine's behavior grew bolder. She began staying out later. She fabricated business trips. Once she forgot her wedding ring on the bathroom counter, claiming she had removed it while moisturizing. Alaric noted everything, documented every lie, every timestamp, every touch, not meant for him. He began withdrawing emotionally, a little colder each day. Just enough for her to feel something was shifting, but not enough for her to suspect he knew. It was like watching someone walk across thin ice, oblivious to the cracks forming beneath their feet. And then came the final fracture. The moment he found a recording. Not just words, not just glances, but a conversation buried on a device Seraphine had used during her music projects, a backup file that hadn't been deleted. In it, she spoke to Caelum about how they would phase Alaric out, how they'd convince him he needed a break, how once his company merged with a foreign investor, arranged by Caelum, they'd move in, claim their share, and disappear. It wasn't just infidelity, it was a coup, and they had planned it down to the week. Alaric listened to the entire recording once, then again. Every second scorched itself into his brain. The worst part wasn't the logistics, it was how easily they spoke about it, how confident they were in his oblivion. It was Seraphine's voice that destroyed him most. "I think he's starting to suspect," she had said. Caelum laughed in the recording. "So what? He won't do anything. He never does. That's why this works. He trusts you too much." That was the moment Alaric stopped loving her. The moment he realized trust wasn't just broken, it was poisoned. That night, Alaric stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her sleep. The woman he had protected, uplifted, believed in more than himself. He felt nothing, not rage, not heartbreak, just vacancy. Something inside him had been hollowed out, and in its place he began building something new, not revenge, reconstruction, because if they had planned everything, so would he, and his plan would be flawless. Alaric didn't allow himself to react, not with emotion, not with haste. The moment he finished listening to the recording of Seraphine and Caelum plotting his downfall, something inside him solidified. Like steel forging itself in fire, his resolve became impenetrable. They had spent months, perhaps years, building a web behind his back. Now he would untangle every thread and reweave it into their undoing. The first step was distance, not physical, but strategic. Alaric maintained the facade of normalcy. He still kissed Seraphine good morning, still responded to Caelum's emails like the trusting client he had always been. But beneath that calm surface, he had begun building his own covert operation. He called in his oldest friend from MIT, Theo Nguyen, a cybersecurity consultant with a knack for tracking encrypted communication. No names were used, no details spoken aloud. Theo was simply told to monitor internal vulnerabilities within Alaric's firm, especially concerning their lead legal advisor. Theo didn't ask questions. He delivered results. Within 2 weeks, Alaric had access to a shadow trail of Caelum's digital activity. Private messages, deleted texts, hidden cloud folders. More than infidelity, there were corporate breaches, leaks to rival firms, even tentative talks with a Chinese conglomerate about a potential buyout using insider leverage. It was worse than betrayal. It was espionage. Seraphine's trail was more emotional than calculated. Her communications with Caelum were filled with longing, code phrases, hotel receipts tucked under aliases. Yet even in those, Alaric found no hesitation, no remorse. She wasn't trapped in an affair. She had willingly stepped into it, spun its silken threads with practiced fingers. That realization hurt more than he admitted. He brought Lisa, Caelum's wife, into the picture next. They hadn't spoken in years, not beyond polite greetings at functions. But Alaric remembered her sharp eyes, her keen intuition, and more importantly, he remembered the look on her face when Caelum would ignore her across the room. Their meeting was brief and private. Lisa sat across from him in a quiet rooftop bar, her expression unreadable. "I know," she said before he could open his mouth. "You do?" She nodded slowly. "I just never had proof." Alaric slid his phone across the table. "You do now." She listened in silence, not a single tear. When the recording ended, she locked the screen and pushed the phone back. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," he said, "but now I have to act." Lisa leaned forward. "Then I want in." She didn't want revenge. She wanted truth and protection for her children, for her reputation, for the remnants of her dignity. Together, they mapped out Caelum's vulnerabilities: offshore accounts hidden through shell companies, real estate purchased under Lisa's name without consent, financial manipulation within the Vane family trust. Alaric, ever meticulous, coordinated with his internal legal team under the guise of restructuring. No one suspected. Why would they? He was still the calm, generous CEO, still the loving husband, still the friend. And all the while, he watched them burn themselves alive with greed. One night, he asked Seraphine over dinner, "Do you ever think about the future? What it'll look like for us in 10 years? She smiled, almost dreamily. "Sometimes I think we'll be somewhere quiet, just the two of us, out of the public eye." "Sounds peaceful," he said. In her eyes, he saw none of the guilt he once hoped to find, only the fantasy of a future she planned to rip from him. That was the night he stopped waiting for remorse. His next step involved Seraphine's foundation, the one he had helped her launch, a charity for underprivileged youth musicians. It was legitimate on paper, but Alaric suspected Caelum had used it to launder money or shift taxable assets. With Theo's help, they traced irregular donations, inflated expense reports, and unreported international transfers. Seraphine's dream project was now a loaded gun, and Alaric had his finger on the trigger. Yet amidst all this, the hardest part remained the emotional rot. He had moments, late nights when he couldn't sleep, standing in the kitchen with a glass of untouched scotch, where memories would crawl back in. The way Seraphine used to cry when moved by a symphony, the way Caelum had toasted him the night he closed his first 100mm deal. They had loved him, or pretended to, and that distinction no longer mattered. Everything now was a performance, his life, a stage, and he, the director, unseen, omniscient, cruel if necessary. The final phase began with subtle sabotage. Caelum was scheduled to speak at a tech legal innovation summit. Alaric had his team send updated materials containing confidential Vane tech data disguised as public case studies. He knew Caelum wouldn't check. He rarely did. The man's ego was his Achilles heel. The moment Caelum presented them, 2 compliance officers, coincidentally in attendance, flagged the breach. Investigations were opened. The firm's board called an emergency meeting. Caelum was suspended pending review. He called Alaric that night, furious. "I don't know how this happened," he snapped. "You believe me, right?" Alaric's voice was calm. "Of course. We'll sort it out. Just lay low." Meanwhile, Seraphine found her foundation frozen under a surprise audit. "Something about missing declarations from 2 years ago," she said, pacing their living room. Alaric looked up from his laptop, expression unreadable. "That's odd. Didn't Caelum oversee your filings?" Her face flickered. He saw it then, the first crack. A tremble of doubt, and once it started, he knew it wouldn't stop. Alaric had been patient, precise. He had laid the groundwork without ever raising his voice, without even breaking a sweat. Now the final pieces were shifting into place. All he had to do was pull the curtain back and let them take their final bow. The day Alaric decided to burn everything down, the sky was unnaturally clear. The kind of sharp golden sunlight that made lies look cleaner, people appear happier, and the illusion of perfection more convincing. He chose it deliberately. There was a cruel poetry in exposing darkness under the brightest light. It was the Vane Foundation's annual gala, an opulent gathering of the city's elite, donors, public officials, and journalists. A celebration of philanthropy, of Seraphine's crowning achievement. She had planned it meticulously for months. Every detail screamed elegance. Every camera would be there. And Alaric ensured every lens was pointed precisely where he wanted. He didn't arrive late. He arrived last. Dressed in a custom midnight suit, he walked in alone. No Seraphine at his side, no prepared speech, just a small flash drive in his pocket and a storm behind his eyes. The music swelled as he approached the stage. Seraphine was already speaking, radiant under the chandeliers, thanking guests for their generosity, sharing hopeful statistics. Her voice was steady, her mask still intact. Then she saw him, and her smile faltered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alaric said as he took the mic, gently guiding her aside, "thank you for joining us this evening. Before we continue, I'd like to offer a different kind of transparency, one we owe to every donor, every supporter, and to the truth." The room shifted. People leaned in. The lighting dimmed. Behind him, on the massive screen meant for slideshow memories, Theo, operating from the AV booth, began to play the first file. It was an audio recording. Seraphine's voice, Caelum's voice, whispered planning, mockery, discussing accounts, diverting attention, and, most damningly, the phrase, "Once we're done with Alaric, it'll all be ours." Gasps. Then silence so thick it felt like gravity had doubled. Seraphine froze. Caelum, seated near the front, went pale. Alaric's voice didn't rise. It didn't break. It was surgical. "I trusted you both, with my company, my marriage, my life, and in return, you plotted to dismantle everything I built." He turned to Seraphine, whose hands now trembled, mascara smudging at the corners. "You used my name to build your empire, but now it will bury you." Theo cued the next file, emails between Caelum and foreign competitors, proof of corporate sabotage, then bank transfers through Seraphine's foundation, illicit payouts, phantom donors, every piece authenticated, time-stamped, admissible in court. Lisa, now seated beside a stunned group of Caelum's former partners, stood up and walked out without a word. Security escorted Caelum before the final video even finished. And Seraphine. Seraphine stood on stage, locked in the spotlight, nowhere to run. Her world crumbled around her in crystal and applause, because some guests clapped, not out of joy, but out of sheer disbelief at the spectacle of it all. By the next morning, the headlines were merciless. Power couple exposed in scandalous corporate coup, charity queen's empire built on lies, Vane Tech CEO orchestrates legendary takedown. But for Alaric, the real reckoning came in the quiet aftermath. Seraphine didn't run. She couldn't. Her assets were frozen, her foundation under investigation, and Caelum's firm had dropped him immediately. They were pariahs, stripped of power, reputation, and leverage. She came to the house one last time, uninvited. Alaric was packing up his office, ready to move out of the estate and into a smaller place across town. Not out of necessity, but symbolism. This house had become a mausoleum of memories. Seraphine stepped inside, pale and shaking. "You planned all of this," she whispered. "For how long?" "Long enough," he replied without looking up. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did. I was lost. Caelum, he made me feel seen. You were always working, always out of reach. Alaric finally looked at her. So you burned our life down to feel seen? Tears welled in her eyes. I don't know what I wanted, but I want to fix this. He laughed, quiet and bitter. There is no fixing this. Not because I won't let you, but because you never tried until you were caught. She stepped closer. Please, we can rebuild. We can be something again. He looked at her, not the woman he loved, but the stranger who wore her face. You and Caelum plan to erase me. I'm simply giving you what you wanted, a life without me. She fell to her knees then, begging. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me like this. But Alaric had already left, emotionally, spiritually. He had walked away the day he heard the recording. This was just the paperwork. She cried, not just for what she had lost, but for realizing she never understood him at all. Days turned into weeks. Caelum attempted to negotiate a deal, offering up Seraphine in exchange for reduced charges. The authorities weren't moved. With Theo's digital trail, Lisa's testimony, and Alaric's evidence, both Caelum and Seraphine were formally indicted. The Vane name survived, but they didn't. And in the final twist, Alaric transferred Seraphine's frozen shares of the foundation, not to himself, but to a group of young musicians who had once benefited from her charity. The irony was brutal. She would watch her legacy live on, without her. Alaric didn't celebrate. He didn't throw parties. He didn't gloat. He simply rebuilt, quietly, away from headlines, away from lies. And when asked by an old friend if he ever missed them, his wife, his best friend, his old life, he only said, I miss who they pretended to be. And that, he decided, was a grief worth surviving. The conference room had fallen into stunned silence long after the confrontation. The echo of Alaric's final words still hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, and no one moved, as if afraid that any sudden gesture might reawaken the destruction that had just unfolded. Caelum had been escorted out, trembling beneath the weight of exposed secrets and professional ruin. Seraphine had remained by Alaric's side, a quiet pillar of support, her eyes unwavering even as the room dissolved into whispers. Alaric sat in his office days later, the sunlight slanting across his desk. The adrenaline had long faded, replaced now with a deep, gnawing ache. He had won, by all accounts. Caelum had lost everything, his prestigious position, his reputation in the legal field, and the public's trust. The firm's board had issued a swift dismissal. Worse still, Caelum's clients had fled in waves, unwilling to associate with someone tainted by both scandal and disloyalty. The legal community, once his playground, had turned cold and unrecognizable. But victories like this never came without scars. Alaric wasn't the same man who had once stood beside Caelum, sharing drinks, ideas, and a vision for the future. That man had died the day he saw his sister's photo on Caelum's hidden burner phone. The man who remained was sharper, quieter, and lonelier. He'd thought revenge might fill the hollow that betrayal left behind. It didn't. It only cleaned the wound, cauterized it with fire, and left behind a scar. Seraphine, too, had changed. She no longer played in orchestras or accepted concert invitations. Her love for music remained, but her need to retreat into solitude had deepened. She moved into a quiet lake house, away from the city and its eyes, spending her days in slow recovery. She and Alaric spoke often, healing each other in ways only siblings who had burned the world together could. One autumn afternoon, she told him, I thought taking him down would bring me peace, but all I feel is emptiness. Alaric had nodded, understanding too well. It was never about peace, he said. It was about truth, and truth has never been kind. Caelum tried to fight back at first. He filed a slander lawsuit against Alaric, hoping to regain some control. But the mountain of documented proof, recordings, and the testimony of insiders like Andrea, the assistant who had handed over the schedule logs, dismantled his case before it even reached court. Instead of redemption, he found deeper disgrace. He withdrew the lawsuit and disappeared from the public eye. Rumors swirled that he'd left the country, attempting to restart his life under a different name. But Alaric had no desire to chase him further. He'd already taken what truly mattered to Caelum: his name, his power, and the illusion that he was untouchable. What Alaric hadn't expected was how much sympathy Seraphine received once the truth came to light. Once seen as a mysterious recluse, she now stood as a woman wronged, manipulated, used, and brave enough to expose the man she once loved. The narrative had shifted. She wasn't just the mistress, she was the whistleblower, a survivor. That shift didn't lessen the weight she carried. The guilt, though not hers to own, settled in the bones. She blamed herself for not seeing through Caelum sooner, for betraying her brother, even if unknowingly, and worst of all, for still missing the man Caelum had pretended to be. Alaric never blamed her. If anything, his respect for her grew. She had stood before the world and chosen truth over shame. She could have buried everything, disappeared, left him to fight alone. Instead, she became the weapon he needed most, the one that could pierce through Caelum's lies with quiet, devastating precision. One rainy evening, Alaric visited Seraphine at her lake house. She was standing on the dock, watching the rain blur the surface of the water. He handed her a letter. "It's from Caelum," he said. She didn't open it immediately. She held it, stared at the name scrawled across the envelope. Then, with the same composure she had shown at the firm's press conference, she tossed it into the lake. "I know what it'll say," she murmured. "He regrets getting caught." Alaric stood beside her in silence. There was nothing else to say. Months passed. Alaric slowly rebuilt his life. The scandal had brought media attention, but he never gave interviews. He declined all opportunities to monetize his story. He went back to work, albeit with fewer late nights and more weekends spent hiking or reading. He'd become a man who valued peace over ambition. One day, he stumbled upon a letter Seraphine had written but never sent. In it, she wrote, "To my brother, thank you for not letting my shame define me, for seeing through the chaos and still choosing to stand beside me. In the end, we both lost a man we loved in different ways, but we found the truth, and maybe that's the only justice we'll ever truly have." He kept the letter. The story didn't end with arrests or violence or public meltdowns. It ended in quiet closure, in the realization that revenge wasn't about rage, it was about reclaiming what was stolen: dignity, agency, and the ability to sleep without wondering what truths lay in shadows. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was also about love, the kind that remains after betrayal, the kind that binds a brother and sister, not with blood alone, but with the fire of shared pain and the resolve never to be silenced again. Alaric didn't forgive Caelum. Some betrayals weren't meant to be forgiven, but he moved forward, not because it was easy, but because staying behind would have meant Caelum still had power, and that, Alaric vowed, would never happen again. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to tell, not because of the betrayal itself, but because of what came after. The silence, the doubt, the nights I lay awake, wondering how I missed the signs, wondering if it was my fault, if I had just been more present, more suspicious, more anything. But the truth is, betrayal doesn't wear a mask you can always see. Sometimes it wears the face of a best friend, a business partner, a lover, a brother. I never imagined that the person I trusted most, my business partner, my best man at the wedding, the uncle to my future children, would turn out to be the one who hurt me the deepest. And I never imagined that the person he used would be my sister. That part, that still hurts. But this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about what comes after, about reclaiming your voice, your agency, your truth, about the power of patience, about justice that doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be seen. If you've ever been lied to, used, or broken by someone you thought would protect you, know this: you are not alone. Your silence doesn't have to be permanent, and your pain, though heavy now, can be forged into something sharp, something purposeful. You don't have to destroy them. You just have to make sure they can never destroy you again. I didn't get everything back, but I got myself back. And sometimes, that's the only revenge you ever really need. This was my story. Now, it's yours too. Share it, if it spoke to you, because someone out there might need to hear it more than you think.